Tom Hanks finds a soldier's letter that abruptly ends with the words, "If you're reading this, I'm already gone." A mysterious address leads him to a forgotten town where a 98-year-old widow has waited decades for news from the front. In her home, the clock stopped at the hour of the last letter, and the garden is overgrown with roses, crimson like blood on snow. The letter, lost in the trenches of 1943, holds the secret of an unborn daughter and a promise that outlived the war. As a guitar plays for the first time in 80 years, the whole town joins in song, even those long gone. But when a rose the color of a military uniform blooms in the garden, Tom realizes some stories are stronger than death. Why did the clock in the widow's home start ticking again? Who left a postcard signed with the letter E on the day of her death? And how could one letter bridge eras, prompting the actor to write to his daughter for the first time in years? Stay with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The Brooklyn attic smelled as if time itself had rotted away. The wooden beams, gnawed by dampness, creaked under Tom Hanks' feet, warning him, "Be careful, stories sleep here that don't want to be awakened." He crouched down, brushing a cobweb off his shoulder, and the beam of his flashlight revealed an old trunk, iron-bound with rusty hinges. Inside, under a layer of dust, lay letters. Dozens of envelopes, yellowed like autumn leaves, with addresses faded to ghostly ink imprints. Tom ran his finger over the top one. Postmark, 1943. He hadn't planned this. Filming a historical drama about World War II? Yes, that was on his schedule. But now, during a break between takes, he just wanted to find a quiet corner to catch his breath. The attic of the old house on Atlantic Avenue seemed like the perfect refuge, until his gaze fell on the trunk, and his fingers began flipping through the letters, like pages of someone else's diary. The handwriting varied: angular, hurried, tender. Soldiers' triangles folded with trembling hands. Long messages written by the light of oil lamps. Tom froze when he found that particular envelope. Not a triangle, but a regular one with a torn edge. On it, in twilight-colored ink, was written, Eleanor. The name echoed in the silence like a whisper from the past. Inside was a single sheet, written on both sides. "Dear Ellie, if you're reading this, I'm already gone." The first line pierced his consciousness like a shard. Tom leaned back on his heels, feeling a chill run down his spine. Outside, the wind howled, chasing leaves across the pavement, as fragile as this paper. He continued reading, though each paragraph felt like an intrusion into a secret. Today our platoon passed by a farm. Roses bloomed in the garden, red like blood on snow. I picked one, hid it in my pocket. Then I remembered how you laughed when I gave you flowers. Joseph, you know they'll wilt. But you still put them in water. I didn't understand why then. Now I do. Beauty is worth it, even if it's not eternal. Tom exhaled. Downstairs on the set, someone shouted, "Action!" but the sound seemed muffled, swallowed by the passage of years. He turned the page. The last paragraph was written differently. The letters danced. The lines sloped downward, as if the writer's hand had trembled. "Ellie, I'm not afraid to die. I'm afraid I won't have time to say what's most important. We'll name her Clara, like your mother. If it's a girl. If I." It ended there. No signature, no date. Just a stain in the corner of the page, round like a tear or raindrop. Tom pressed his hand to his chest, where a medallion with his daughter's photo lay under his shirt. If it's a girl. Joseph's voice, which he had never heard, echoed in his mind, young, with a slight rasp, like his own father's, who returned from Vietnam and never told half his stories. He carefully folded the letter, but something fell out of the envelope. A small photograph, the size of a business card. A young woman in a floral print dress, sitting on a porch. Behind her, a sign, 17 Main Street, Greenville, Ohio. On the back, a shaky inscription, "My Ellie, May 1942. Tom stood up, holding onto a beam. The flashlight beam flickered, illuminating an old guitar with broken strings in the corner of the attic. He didn't know why he took it. Maybe because Joseph, according to the letter, sang Blue Moon under Eleanor's window. or because Tom, at 60, suddenly felt the years compress into a single moment where past and present intertwined, like those roses in the soldier's memory. Descending the stairs, he bumped into a props assistant, a guy in a cap, lugging a box of helmets. "Mr. Hanks, where have you been? The director is looking for you." "Sorry," Tom interrupted, not stopping. "Tell him I'll be back in an hour." He stepped outside, tucking the letter into his jacket's inner pocket. The rain, which had started in the morning, now poured down, turning Brooklyn into a blurred watercolor. Tom walked, not noticing the puddles. Joseph's voice echoed in his ears. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone." He stopped at a phone booth, red like the rose from the letter. He dialed his assistant's number. "I need a ticket to Ohio." "Yes, today." "No, it's not for the film." The evening flight ascended through the clouds as Tom, gazing out the window, pulled out the letter again. Under the blue cabin lights, the ink shimmered silver. He imagined Joseph writing it, perhaps in a trench under the roar of shells. How he folded the sheet, kissed the envelope, and then something went wrong. The letter never arrived. Lost in time, like hundreds of others. But why this one? Why did he, Tom, find it? A flight attendant offered coffee. He declined, continuing to trace the lines with his finger. "Clara, like your mother. If Joseph had returned, would this girl have been born? Or was she born, never knowing her father? And Eleanor, how old would she be now? 90? 100? Or had she long since joined Joseph under the same stone?" The plane broke through the cloud layer. The moon, full and cold, hung in the inky sky. Tom closed his eyes. He dreamed of trenches he had never seen and a woman on a porch, waiting. Greenville greeted him with the scent of roasted chestnuts and a silence that had settled on the streets like dust on old shop windows. The Ohio town seemed carved from autumn, red maples, leaning lampposts, and sidewalks littered with leaves resembling burnt calendar pages. Tom walked down Main Street, comparing it to the photo from the letter. House number 17 should have been there, but in its place stood a gas station with a neon red and yellow logo advertising coffee discounts. He froze, clutching the envelope in his pocket. The wind picked up a maple leaf and pressed it against the glass of the cash register, as if the past was trying to glimpse the present. Behind Tom, the door of an antique shop creaked open. An old man in suspenders, his face resembling the bark of an ancient oak, stood in the doorway. Looking for something? His voice was like the creak of unoiled hinges. "The house that used to be here." Tom showed him the photograph. "Eleanor." The old man adjusted his glasses, and suddenly his eyes, cloudy as rain puddles, came to life. "Ellie Carter?" He nodded westward. "She moved after the war. Over there, beyond the river, where the roses grow." The road wound along the river, its water the color of lead. Tom walked past half-ruined barns, their boards creaking in the wind like the bones of old horses. On a hill, entwined with ivy, stood a house, white, with columns that once proudly stood tall. Now, they leaned like time's sentinels, forgetting what they were supposed to watch over. The garden around, it was an impenetrable tangle of rose bushes and roses, their crimson petals scattered on the ground like drops of dried blood. He found her on the porch, in a rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket the color of army wool. Eleanor must have been nearly 100, but her posture retained a strange grace, back straight, hands folded on her lap, as if she still waited for the mailman. "Mrs. Carter?" Tom climbed the steps, each one creaking under his weight. She turned her head slowly, as if afraid to spill her memories. Her eyes were pale blue, like faded ink on a soldier's letter. "You're not from the draft board," she said, and it wasn't a question. Tom handed her the envelope. Her hands, parchment-like, with veins resembling the roots of an old tree, trembled as she took it. "Joseph," the name escaped her lips in a whisper that seemed to have been stored within her for decades. She didn't read it. She simply pressed the letter to her chest, where a medallion on a chain was visible under her wool dress. There was a strange certainty in her movements, as if she knew this moment would come. She stood without help, the blanket sliding to the floor, and Tom saw her dress, blue with small white polka dots like the one in the 1942 photograph. It hung on her like a hanger, but there was a terrible meaning in it. Time had consumed her flesh, but not her memory. Comaine. She pushed the door open, and Tom stepped into the past. The living room smelled of lavender and dust. On the mantel, a clock with stopped hands, 8:15. Next to it, in a silver frame, a photo, young Joseph in uniform, a guitar slung over his shoulder. The same instrument Tom had seen in the Brooklyn attic. He sang Blue Moon under my window every Sunday. Eleanor traced the glass frame with her finger. His voice was like rain on tin, rough but melodic. The last time I heard it was June 12th, 1944. She sat in the armchair, the letters still pressed to her chest. Tom noticed how a sunbeam, breaking through the curtains, fell on her feet, tiny, in worn shoes that had once danced to Glenn Miller's music. "You'll ask why I waited?" She smiled, and in that moment, Tom saw the girl from the photograph. Because letters aren't just paper. They're breath. As long as it hasn't arrived, the cinder is still alive. She stood, approached his secretary with a worn top, and pulled open a drawer full of envelopes, all with 1940 stamps, all unopened. "I wrote to him every Thursday, even after the death notice, even after Clara was born." Her voice trembled at the name. "She died at 6. Polio." Tom swallowed the lump in his throat. Somewhere outside, a thrush sang, and its melody mixed with the sound of tearing paper. Eleanor opened Joseph's letter for the first time in 80 years. "We'll name her Clara, like your mother. If it's a girl." She read aloud, and the words hung in the air like smoke from a snuff candle. She pulled out a small medallion from under her dress collar, with Joseph's photo and a lock of blonde hair. "Hers," she whispered. The only thing left. Silence, so profound that the sound of falling rose petals outside could be heard. Tom reached for the guitar on the wall, instinctively, like a lifeline. The instrument rang hollow, as if the strings remembered only sad melodies. "Play," Eleanor said, closing her eyes. He would have wanted it. He struck a chord. Wrong, off key. But when the old woman sang, her voice cracked like a porcelain cup. The words of Blue Moon took on new life. They floated through the dusty curtains, mingled with the whisper of the river outside and the thrush's cry in the rose thicket. And then she cried, silently, as those who have long since spent all their tears. Her fingers clutched the medallion as if it might turn to dust at a touch. "Thank you," she said when the last note faded into the twilight. Now he's home. Tom stepped onto the porch. In the distance, the windows of the gas station on Main Street glowed like beacons of another time. He pulled out his phone to cancel his return flight, but instead dialed his daughter's number. The melody of the ringtone blended with the wind, carrying rose petals to where the river met the night. October 1943 smelled of mud and gunpowder. Joseph pressed his back against the trench wall, trying to shield the oil lamp from the wind howling like a wounded beast. In his tunic pocket lay a rose petal, crumpled, brown at the edges, but still smelling of summer. He took out a pencil, broken in half during last week's bombing, and began to write on the back of a map. "Dear Ellie, today I had a dream. Shells exploded somewhere beyond the hill, shaking the ground, but he wrote as if deaf. We were floating in a boat. You were laughing, and I was trying to catch the sun's reflection in your hair. I woke up because I was cold. Even dreams freeze here." The letters blurred from the damp, turning into a web, but he hurried. He knew they would be sent on the offensive tomorrow. A guitar chord cut through the noise. In the neighboring trench, someone was playing Blue Moon. Joseph lifted his head, catching the familiar melody, and suddenly smiled, for the first time in months. "Ellie, if I return, I'll learn to play. I promise." He reached into his coat, feeling for the medallion with her photograph. The cold metal burned his palm as if charging it with warmth. En explosion royale de Soudanly. The earth heaved, the lamp went out, and the map caught fire, charring at the edges. Joseph fell, covering his head with his hands, but a shard still pierced his side, sharp like a pang of conscience. He felt no pain, only warmth spreading under his tunic. His fingers clutched the medallion, and with his other hand, he reached for the letter, now so heavy. Ellie, if you're reading this, the ink mixed with blood, turning the last words into a purple stain. The letter slipped from his weakening fingers, caught by the dirty wind. It flew over the trenches, stuck to a nurse's boot as she ran toward the screams, and fell into a puddle, where a trembling hand in a glove with worn fingers picked it up. "Oh God," the nurse whispered, unfolding the wet sheet. Her face, smeared with soot and blood, contorted. She stuffed the letter into a bag with a red cross, next to a vial of morphine and a wedding ring she hadn't managed to give to a dying lieutenant. The bag outlived her by 3 days. When a shell hit the field hospital, they found it in a crater, covered in dirt like a time capsule. The cross on the canvas had faded to pink, but the letter inside remained intact, a ghost of love that outlived its creators. Tom stood in the basement of the Greenville Local History Museum, where the air smelled of mothballs and forgotten stories. On the table before him lay the very same bag, now an exhibit labeled Nurse Mary Clark, killed at Monte Cassino, 1944. His fingers traced the seam where an Oscalok had once torn it. The curator, a frail woman in glasses like Eleanor's, silently handed him a box with the contents. Joseph's letter lay atop yellowed bandages. Tom unfolded it, seeing the stain, not from rain, but from blood, soaked into the lines about the boat and sunbeams. Underneath the letter, something metallic gleamed, a medallion with a chain identical to the one Eleanor wore. He rushed to her house, not noticing the rose thorns tearing his jacket. Eleanor sat on the porch as if she hadn't moved since yesterday. "Is this yours?" Tom held out the medallion. Her fingers closed around it, as if catching a butterfly. "I gave it to him the day he left, so he would remember." She clicked open the locket, revealing the faded photo. "And this, where did you find it?" Tom silently unfolded the letter. She didn't read it, just brought the sheet to her lips, as she might have once kissed the envelopes on Thursdays. "He's always with me," she whispered, looking at the roses. "Even when I was angry that he didn't return. Even when I buried Clara." She stood up, suddenly animated, and led Tom into the garden. Among the thorns by an old apple tree lay a stone inscribed Clara, 1939 to 1945. "He wanted a boat," Eleanor said, plucking a rose. "And I planted a garden, so the roots would hold." Tom took out the guitar he had brought from the house. He sat by the stone, playing the chord he had practiced the night before on YouTube. The first notes of Blue Moon sounded off-key, but Eleanor sang, softly, as if afraid to scare away the shadows. By evening, others heard them. Neighbors, children, and elders on porches. All were drawn to house number 17, where music mingled with the scent of roses. Someone brought lanterns, another a thermos of apple cider. Tom played until his fingers went numb, and Eleanor sang until her voice turned to a whisper. When the moon rose over the river, she fell asleep in the rocking chair, clutching the letter and medallion. Tom covered her with a blanket and sat on the steps, taking out his notebook. "Dear Julia, forgive me for not writing sooner. Today I understood we write letters not for a response, but so someone holds them when we're gone." Somewhere in the garden, a petal fell, echoed by the click of the clock in the living room. The hands trembled, shifting from 8:15 to 8:16. Dawn found Tom on Eleanor's porch, cleaning the guitar strings with a cloth soaked in wine vinegar. The instrument seemed to resist. The wood creaked, and the frets treacherously slipped from under his fingers, as if loyal only to one owner. But when the first rays of the sun gilded the neck, Tom heard a faint ring, like the echo of a long-forgotten chord. He didn't notice the gathering crowd. First, a boy on a bicycle braking at the gate. Then a couple of retirees with folding chairs. By noon, the end of the street was filled with cars and baby strollers. The news of that actor and the old lady with the war story had spread faster than autumn wind. Eleanor emerged in a dress the color of a cornflower sky, the same one from her 1942 wedding photo. Around her neck sparkled 2 medallions, hers and Joseph's. She sat in a chair under the apple tree, where the ground was strewn with petals, as if someone had prepared a crimson carpet for unseen guests. The first notes of Blue Moon escaped the guitar hesitantly. Tom closed his eyes, imagining Joseph adjusting his tie in front of the barracks mirror, humming this melody. Suddenly, the strings sang anew, clear, bitter, so much so that the ice cream truck's window slammed shut. Eleanor didn't move, but when Tom's gravelly voice reached the words, "You knew just what I was there for," her hand reached for the empty chair beside her. Rose petals swirled in a sudden gust of wind, and for a moment, everyone thought they saw a shadow in the whirlwind. A young man in uniform, a guitar on his back, a smile like a reflection in a cracked mirror. By the third verse, the whole park was singing. Elders whose voices remembered the song. Children, not understanding the words, but feeling the tremor in the air. Even the birds fell silent, yielding to memory. Tom saw Eleanor's lips moving, addressing the shadows. "See, Joseph, we didn't need a boat after all." Her fingers clutched the medallions, joining the metal as one. Two halves of a heart, finally united. When the last note dissolved into applause, she stood up, not like an old woman, but lightly, as if shedding the weight of decades. She approached Tom, touched the guitar where drops had appeared on the soundboard like the wood's tears. "He thanks you," she said simply. That evening, as Tom cleared the tables, he found a rose under the apple tree, crimson, with petals sharp as tongues of flame. Eleanor stood by the window, her silhouette reminiscent of the girl from the 1942 porch. In her room, the clock showed 8:17. He left at dawn, leaving the guitar by Clara's stone. In his pocket was a letter to his daughter, scented with lavender and gunpowder. The bus pulled away as the first rose in Eleanor's garden bloomed with a crack, like a heartstring snapping. Morning came with frost, turning the roses into crystalline sculptures. Tom approached Eleanor's house, carrying an envelope marked "to be claimed," a reply from his daughter that he had reread throughout his journey from New York. The gate creaked differently, as if warning, "There is no more waiting here." He found her in the garden, sitting by Clara's stone, with Joseph's letter on her lap and a smile frozen between worlds. Her hands, like a tangle of roots, clutched the medallions. The clock in the living room read 8:18. He called no one. He simply knelt, brushing frost from the roses that Eleanor called Joseph's blood. Her cornflower blue dress blended with the sky, and dew sparkled in her hair, as if in her final moment she had become part of this garden, where time was measured not by hours, but by blooming. He buried the letter under the largest rose, whose thorns left scars on his palms like lines of text. The shovel clinked against the frozen earth, turning up black clods that smelled of war and forgotten promises. When the envelope disappeared beneath the soil, Tom remembered Joseph's words, "Beauty is worth it, even if it's not eternal." At dawn, the rose bloomed. Crimson, like the infantry uniform of 1943, its bud opened with a soft crack, as if a guitar string had snapped, the one Tom had left by the stone. Petals fell onto Eleanor's grave, mingling with her gray hair. In his jacket pocket waited a postcard. It had arrived that morning, though the postmark read, "Greenville, Ohio, November 10th. On the back, a shaky hand had written, "Thank you for the bridge through time." Joseph finally finished his song. He stood at the Veterans Memorial, where granite slabs breathed cold. His fingers traced the names. Joseph Carter was not among them. Only somewhere in Europe, in an unnamed field, his bones had become fertilizer for poppies. But here, under the rose in Ohio, lived a story that would outlast granite. "Stories are people who continue to live as long as we remember them," he said aloud, and the echo carried the words to the lampposts lighting up on Main Street. His phone rang in his pocket. It was his daughter. He answered, watching as the last petal fell onto the postcard. "Dad, where are you?" Her voice sounded like Blue Moon played on an out-of-tune guitar. "On my way," he said, noticing a soldier's shadow sitting on a bench by the memorial. "I'll tell you a story about roses, letters, and gardens that bloom even in winter." Sunset faded, tinting the names on the plaque the color of blood, hope, and unfinished songs. Somewhere in Greenville, a rose bent under the snow, guarding the letter that had finally found its home. Winter arrived suddenly, wrapping Greenville in a shroud of frost. Tom stood at the memorial, where snow lay on the granite slabs like white letters from those who never saw spring. His fingers traced the engraved names, pausing at the empty space between Carlson and Kennedy, where Joseph Carter might have been. The wind whistled the melody of Blue Moon in his ears, and in his pocket, a postcard from Eleanor, dated the day of her death, warmed his hand. He sat on a bench, brushing off the snow, which was warmer than he expected. From his bag, he took out a notebook, the same one where he once made notes for his role in a war drama. Now the pages were filled with her story, of roses growing through a military coat, of clocks measuring the time of love, not death, of a girl whose name became a bridge between worlds. A snowflake fell on the line. We write letters so someone holds them when we're gone, and froze, as if wanting to become part of the text. Tom closed the notebook, feeling a presence behind him, light barely imprinted on the snow. He didn't turn around. A familiar warmth, like that of the medallion on his chest, told him not to. The path to Eleanor's house had become a trail of ghosts. Streetlights flickered, recalling the evening when the garden sang in a chorus of the living and the dead. The gate, now tied with a black ribbon, creaked mournfully. Roses stood, bent under snowy caps, their crimson heads like drops of frozen blood. At the roots of the largest one, the one that grew over the letter, lay a guitar. Its strings, covered in frost, had turned into crystalline threads. Tom touched them, and the instrument sighed. The sound, like the cracking of ice, spread through the garden, awakening dormant memories. Somewhere, a rocking chair creaked, pages of unfinished letters rustled in the secretary, and the clock hands in the living room trembled, showing 8:19. He took out an envelope, a reply from his daughter. Julia wrote about her grandson learning to play the guitar, about starting a garden on her balcony, and about a strange dream. An old woman in a cornflower blue dress giving her a rose. "Dad, that was her, right?" his daughter asked. The snow fell thicker, covering the footprints on the path. Tom leaned against the apple tree where he once sang for the shadows. A branch swayed, shedding clumps of snow, revealing buds, green, tender, defying the frost. Life breaking through the white void. That night, as he left, he saw a light in the taxi window, a candle on Eleanor's windowsill. The flame flickered, casting silhouettes on the walls. A man with a guitar, a girl with braids. A woman dancing in a polka dot dress. The taxi turned onto the highway, and Tom, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, realized he no longer feared silence. A year later, when the first spring rain washed the memorial clean of soot, a rose bloomed by Clara's stone. Not crimson, but white, as if embodying all the unwritten letters. Locals said that at midnight, music could be heard here, a guitar and two voices, male and female, blending in Blue Moon. And Tom, standing on his daughter's balcony in Los Angeles, watered the roses. Below, the city hummed, but he heard something else. The creak of a gate in Ohio, the rustle of pages in a secretary, the ticking of a clock that now showed 8:20. His grandson practiced chords on Joseph's guitar, sent by mail in a box scented with lavender. "Grandpa." The boy looked up. "Are they together now?" Tom gazed at the sunset, where a cloud resembled a boat. "They are everywhere," he said. And as his grandson played, the mistakes sounded more right than any notes. Somewhere in rhythm with him, an empty chair rocked under the apple tree. Petals fell on the nameless granite, and the clock in house number 17 ticked in the rhythm of eternity. Stories like roses do not die. They simply wait to be found.